Hi there, good afternoon. Thank you for bearing with us. Google Slides were having a bit of a moment. Lovely to welcome you all here today. Eric is doing a webinar for us, and today's topic is developer tips to get the most from event sourcing. If you do have any questions, Eric will be able to answer them for you for the end. So just pop them in the chat and he'll ask them at the end. Take it away, Eric.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Natasha. I'm going to be doing some finagling with my keyboard, so hopefully I don't hit next too early. Again, if you have questions, feel free to ask them immediately. I might pause, answer things immediately. Otherwise, there's always the end of the stream. So again, this is developer tips to get the most from event sourcing. And as a recap, I'm Eric. I'm a developer advocate here at EventStore. There are some of my online aliases and URLs you can reach me at or see additional content. Feel free to look at that new YouTube channel it just launched. There's also my cat, which is very, very important that I show. I got to pay the cat tax. His name is King Koopa. If you didn't know, EventStore does webinars fairly frequently. We have another one in a couple weeks with my friend Eve. That's going to be about EventStore DB in software applications in the context of Greenfield, Legacy, and Sidecar. Without going over what I assume he's talking about too much, a lot of us, when we're talking and teaching and educating about event sourcing and EventStore DB, it's similar. It's seemingly in the context of, hey, you have this new application. What a great opportunity to use this type of paradigm. Well, that's not the case a lot of the time. So knowing how to implement it or in a legacy app or have be a sidecar of truth, which if you haven't heard about, there's more incentive for you to check out that webinar. And if you're not in our Discord, you should get in there. There was a really good question asked last night, and we started a thread and discussing that use case and why EventStore DB would be good for them and just clarifying things. Because if you are new to this world of software design that we call event sourcing, EventStore DB, all that kind of stuff, it's a great way to ask questions, get clarity, use the right verbiage, all that kind of stuff. So anyways, all right. Let's talk about communication. No, this isn't me trying to make sure you completed all your human resource internal training courses about how to communicate effectively, though you should certainly do that if you have the chance. But really, I want to kind of highlight how it's my belief that good communication can solve most problems. It's not going to solve a volcano or earthquake from happening, but when it comes to humans, right, speaking to each other, good communication, being able to parse what's being said, ask good questions, very important, right? Sometimes we just won't see eye to eye. Okay. But also sometimes communication is done from artifacts like code, where you might not be able to talk to the original authors of that code, of that system, of that application. And maybe the documentation or comments are lacking, or there are none, which is wonderful. So I'm not the biggest fan of code should tell the story or tell everything, but it's my belief that event sourcing and using other good practices and patterns and strategies that we'll talk about really helps in so many ways beyond just the software, like the socio-technical level. So let's get back to software, because that was pretty high level, right? So let's talk about Dr. Alan Kay. You may know that name or know that individual, that computer scientist, because he helped pioneer windowing graphic user interfaces and also coined the term object-oriented programming. That was many decades ago. He believes he coined it in 66 or 67. And I bring this up because this is a snippet of the larger quote, of the larger email that he sent out. Let me click to this other screen I have and hopefully not make too much of a fool of myself, because I'm gonna do that. But the idea he had when he was coining object-oriented programming and kind of introducing it as an idea was he didn't think about it in terms of like polymorphism and inheritance. That wasn't his goal, those are actually things he attributes to others later on. If you read the full email, he was thinking more at a biological level where the cells communicate, and they communicate by effectively emitting I'm going to get the word wrong, these messages, and nearby cells will either respond, maybe they'll help deliver a protein of some kind, or they will willfully ignore that other cell. Um, and I'm not a biologist, if you couldn't tell. But that was his idea, is that just like computers in a network, they should be able to communicate effectively, and they listen to each other, they can react accordingly, but they all have their own uses and strengths and focuses, right? So it's kind of interesting. I would definitely recommend reading the entire email to get a better vibe, because I'm kind of slaughtering it a little bit, but it's very fascinating. So related to that, well, technically, Alan Kay is from the Midwest, and I'm from the Midwest of America too. And here we have a lot of telemarketing customer service jobs, basically because there's so many telephone lines that when they were being planted across the country, they wound up going through the middle. Surprise. And we kind of have a neutral dialect here in the Midwest, or at least in Nebraska. So for context, where I'm going here is that I've had a lot of customer facing, customer oriented solutioning jobs before I became a grown up and became a programmer. Being able to answer people's questions and maybe get the questions out of them because they are just kind of stating the problem or what they think the problem is, and I have to parse it. So when I was at a help desk trying to understand what the heck is going on when someone says I can't make a phone call or my system's down, what does that mean? So it's being able to communicate effectively, whether the other party is helping or not being helpful, is kind of close to home for me. So let's go back to software world and fast forward. So if you didn't know about this is the Reactive Manifesto. This is about a decade ago that this was published. URLs at the bottom for anything I'm referencing. I think all the slides are covered in case you need to look at it yourself. But a lot of developers, mostly in the FANG space, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, I think I got it right. They were realizing they were having to build very similar systems over and over again that were, if you look at the slides, responsive, resilient, elastic. And I bring this up because to me, and I'm not probably the first to claim it, maybe I am, I doubt it, but it's the idea that this manifesto really to me looks very similar to what Alan Kay was proposing decades ago, right? These cells have specific jobs. They're typically responsive. They're meant to be resilient. They don't want to die, right? They have all these traits. So that way, when you're the goal of these systems, right, is that they don't topple over at the first sign of a problem. Ideally, they don't, when change is necessary, they don't fall over, right? They're durable, they're resilient, they're extendable. So really, I think this is like a spiritual successor to what Alan Kay was getting at. And this will deal with event sourcing, just but these objects, these modules of code, these services, these applications are part of a larger system, like a living organism. And they're meant to evolve. And one word that we use in the software world instead of evolve is extendable, right? Good software, good code, a lot of the time what we claim, it should be extendable, maintainable, testable, things like that. But it should be able to evolve as requirements change, and they inevitably do. So that being said, let me get my slides in order here. So let's fast forward a little bit more. Let's talk about now. Now, these benefits of event-driven architecture are lifted from eventstore.com. There's all sorts of goodies there. Surprise, surprise. But this, I think, regardless if you're looking at this from a lens of event sourcing or whether you don't use event sourcing but want to enable event-driven architecture, these stand on their own. Being able to have loose coupling, embracing asynchrony, because it's modeled after real life. Things, take time to happen. We listen, we react. They aren't instantaneous. So not being afraid of eventual consistency, that's something sometimes trying to explain to stakeholders and end users seems interesting, or that you explain a process could take a few seconds, hopefully shorter than that. And that may seem too long to them, but really, realistically, it's fine. It's okay. But being able to listen, make decisions, and react, or not decide not to react, that's really important. And event sourcing, to me, just kind of enables it, or empowers it rather, even further. So I do have a quiz. So if you're in the chat, hello, first of all. But if you know what this is, you should tell me. I'll give you a second, because I'm sure some of you are watching the video on demand and you're impatient. All right. It's the Triforce. Maybe you know what that is. Maybe you don't. It is from the game series called The Legend of Zelda. It's a great game series. If you're in the chat, you should definitely state what your favorite Zelda game is. I think that's very imperative to why we're here today. But anytime I see this diagram that we have on eventstore.com, I think of that Triforce in Zelda. So I had to bring it up. But really, having these this Triforce plus, because I guess there's 4 things, right? It's greater than the sum of their parts. Having event sourcing, being event driven, having CQRS, so you can clearly have a separation of concerns with commands and queries. It really just brings so much more. It enables a lot more. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about some strategies, some patterns, some tactics. And as I said in the prior webinar I did, we're just going to get deeper and deeper into some of these topics as time goes on. So if you have feedback or very specific things you want to hear, again, put it in the live comments, put it on YouTube, email, whatever, because that's going to have us better serve you. So do you know what's good at communication, right? Bringing this kind of full circle-ish. Event sourcing. Event sourcing is great at communication, not just because we record everything that's happening, all the facts, all the state changes, all the mutations in a system. It's good because when we write code, it makes things easier. And this really is like a high level strategy almost. I guess you could say it's tactical, because if you talk about implementation, it's more at that level. But really, having an event sourced system and being event driven and having good CQRS practices makes maintainability and testability and telling the story and understanding what the heck is happening when you inherit such a system a lot easier. I say that as someone who I inspected a hand-rolled event sourcing system that was about 22 years old, which is kind of impressive because event sourcing wasn't even coined at that time, but they used a giant ledger type system. And even though some of the code was pretty gnarly, had some cobwebs, you could tell exactly what was happening. It was really impressive. So even before CQRS or event sourcing or event streaming, maybe even those terms were coined, there was a system that just treated everything like a ledger, named things well, and was not that bad to work in. So, okay, probably should have hit that next slide earlier, right? So CQRS really helps. And just as a bit of a recap, and then we'll expand to CQRS at large in systems, not just at the application level. We'll cover that. So let's go into that. So CQRS, if you didn't know, and this is again, hopefully a shorter segment, it stands for Command and Query Responsibility Segregation. You used to be asked by Google, did you mean cars? And earlier the other day, I typed CQRS and I added an A on accident. I don't know why, but Google now knows enough, whether that's good or bad, to say, did you mean CQRS? Which I thought was pretty funny. Now, is this diagram CQRS? Yeah, it looks like they're employing CQRS. I don't know enough details, but it looks like there are commands or intent on the left side, and looks like there are queries on the right. There is a clear separation here. And some of you who've been practiced in this space may know where I'm going with this, but you don't need two databases to do CQRS successfully. It's just saying commands and queries are how things get done, and they're separated, and that's that. So I've developed plenty of systems that use a single database. Granted, they're separated by schemas and user permissions and everything, but it's not a requirement. Now, if on the left side you're using Event Store DB, unless your use case is all in memory and things like that, which is totally valid, you probably have one or two or many read databases. So that's something to think about. But CQRS itself doesn't state that. It's not saying you have to do it that way. So yeah, commands express intent. We sometimes call that the write side. So when you look at CQRS from the lens of event sourcing, we talk about it as the write side because you're writing events. Now, especially even as an English speaker, but especially as for folks who don't speak English natively, this is very confusing, right? The right side is on the left. I get it. My sympathies. It's tough out there. English is not easy. But we talk about this left side being the right side or the command side. Again, it depends on the context, but under the lens of event sourcing, a lot of folks will say the right side because that's where the rights and the source of truth is. So let's imagine me, Eric, needs to open a digital shopping cart so I can buy things, right? It's some sort of instance that needs to be spun up for me to successfully purchase things on a website, let's say. So, okay, well, let's have a command to do that. And yes, I'm showing something that could be one line of code. It effectively is, but for those that are newer to this space, I'm definitely seeing and hearing a need to show more code. So we're going to go over some of that code just so there's a better picture that's being painted before we go into deeper strategies. It's encapsulated. It's just a class. This is C#. So a record is kind of like if you're used to Kotlin as a shorthand for the JVM world, it's like a data class. And there's some other languages who employ this as well, but it's just a simple class, right? Saying, hey, what's the card ID? What's the client ID? The client ID would be related to me, Eric. The card ID is saying, hey, this is going to be the card ID associated with this specific stream of events for this specific cart. So, okay, well, we talked about Zelda earlier, right? Let's say I'm buying The Legend of Zelda, so I put it in my cart. Great. There's an add product command. Now, you might want to be very descriptive. It depends on how your code is organized, which is a topic I really thought about bringing up in detail, but they'll have to wait for another day. But it could be called add product to cart if you need that sort of clarity. There's apparently a fire truck going right next door, so if that comes through, I'm sorry. But again, it's just a very simple class that's encapsulating the intent. Hey, what's the card ID of Eric's cart? And what's the product item? Now, product item is a value object of sorts. So just to clarify what it is, because it's not a primitive. I don't think product item is a primitive of any programming language. I could be wrong. But on the right-hand side, it's just the product ID and the quantity. Now, I want to bring this up. Again, I know for those that are a bit more seasoned, you may know this, but how do you ensure good communication in an event source system? How do you ensure these things? That you have a source of truth that makes sense, that you're able to parse these events and have good, rich, well-meaning read models, that you know the intent. Because just getting a little excited here, just because you say you're doing event sourcing doesn't mean you're doing it well. Just because you have good names doesn't mean you're event sourcing well. You need to make sure that the right data in that moment is there, and that you're also capturing the invariants or the business rules, even if they seem boring or taken for granted, or there's a situation where as a programmer you're like, well, of course no one would do this, which I think we can all say we've we've been there on the receiving end and the giving end there of, oops, I didn't think anyone would use this way, right? So hopefully this isn't too small on everyone's screens. I know on my screen it's kind of small. Let me see. Okay. How am I the presenter? Who did this? So again, this is C#, but hopefully this is understandable for anyone used to the C-like syntax. We have a product item class, and we have a create method. Now, I didn't include the an explicit constructor, if you're wondering where that is. Basically, one way to enforce, and there's ways to get around it, but typically the soft way of enforcing this is saying, hey, if you want to instantiate this class into an object, which again, we're going to record as an event in our event store, then you have to create it this way. And maybe your constructor and your language of choice supports this. Again, there's always different constraints. Not going to get into the uber nitty gritty, but yeah, let's make sure the product ID isn't empty. It's not null. If you're not used to the term GUID, it's a globally unique identifier. It's the same thing as a UUID, universally unique identifier. That's another conversation. And yes, this code is making sure that the quantity isn't 0 or negative. Now, there may be a use case where you want that, but in this case, because this is specifically used in conjunction with things being added to a cart, specifically that they exist, not that they're being taken, or they exist and they're being added, not that they're being taken away. In this instance, for this value object to be used correctly, it can't be null and it can't be 0. It has to be a positive number. So can't tell you the line ID, but near the bottom there, right, it says quantity has to be a positive number. And if it passes all those checks, because that is a switch expression for those that aren't familiar with it, then at the bottom it says, okay, here you go. I will return a new product item with the product ID and the quantity. So is this boring? Sure. Good. That is really, I think, what effective, well-meaning, context-heavy, business rule abiding, all these terms are good at. It very clear intent. And yeah, is it boring to write? Sure. Okay. But once it's written, when it's being used and leveraged on the read side, when it's being used to get information out of the data that's being stored, you can go to the bank, so to speak, knowing that all your facts are indeed facts. They are correct. There's going to be no oopsies. There's going to be no exceptions being thrown when you're going through and projecting read models. So the biggest number one strategy here that we're going over, aside from CQRS at large, is that you really should ensure these models for these commands and queries are abiding by all the business rules. And that even means making sure your ints are positive numbers. So if you want to use an unsigned integer, if that's better for you and your team, great, right? That gets into a different conversation, but hopefully this strategy, this larger ideas is being conveyed. So is this domain-driven design? No. See me after class if if you have a question about that. Just because we're using a value object doesn't mean we're doing DDD. A lot of these practices are used in DDD to have very rich, good models that adhere to rules, and you have models that play well with your databases and all that. That, again, separate conversation. But the type of code, oh, I didn't even hit the next slide. There we go. This is why I was laughing. You can laugh at me for doing that. But no, this is not domain-driven design, just because you're using a value object. Does it have some of those similar traits and intent, right? Having the code be explicit when it comes to the rules? Yes, of course. That is why a lot of practitioners of event sourcing are also practitioners of DDD. Again, you don't need one to have the other, just like with CQRS or event-driven architecture, they're orthogonal, right? So let's talk about the query side or the read side, which again, on most diagrams is on the right with the R side. A little confusing, but you might hear those terms when referring to that. Hey, what's happening on the query side? What's happening on the read side? What's happening with projections? What's happening on the reactive side? We'll talk about that reactive name in a little bit. But yeah, queries, granted, they might be more complex, just like how commands may be more complex, but they can be also very simple. You have this nice, simple encapsulated thing saying, hey, get cart. It's only going to be used with queries related to getting cart. And in this case, you only need the cart ID. Could we have a more descriptive name for this query? Sure, we could have get cart by ID. So here we are, get cart by ID. And again, you'll see another no, I almost said helper method. It's arguably not a helper method, but a building method to help construct this. Not in the constructor, but it helps build it and ensures the card ID is not null, it's not empty. And if that is all Gucci, as they say, then you will have a new instance of get cart by ID. Right? Great. Again, very boring, but you're ensuring that things work as intended. Right? You're not having to write is null things inside of your HTTP controllers or at the gRPC service level. It's all in here because even though it's a query, there can be business rules as to how you query certain things like reports and analytics, right? It depends. I'm trying not to say it depends a lot today. We'll see if I do a good job. Now, if you're in the prior webinar I did, or a lot of folks say this as well, the event sourcing superpower, the killer feature, really is that the read side, because you have so much rich data that you can leverage from the write side by having a good separation of streams, by having things being well intended, having enough context in that data, well named streams, which we'll cover a little bit later on. You can then pull and generate very rich reports that ideally are as close to real time as possible. Again, high performant, well-purposed products like Event Store DB that are intended for this type of work are awesome at it. They're really good at projecting and being able to gather all that data. Because again, your downstream consumers, the people that are looking at these read models, reports, analytics, what have you, they might not even know what event sourcing is. They just care about using their SQL tools or document store tools or being able to do Power BI on things. But under the hood, right, yeah, we're doing projections. We're creating these read models for them into their existing tool set. So you're not really upsetting the balance when you introduce ESDB and event sourcing to your ecosystem. Can't get over that enough. I will probably somehow talk about that in every talk I do. That is the superpower. We have rich data. Let's leverage it. Event sourcing arguably could be added to any application. Granted, it might not be worth it for simple use cases, which I covered in the last topic. But if you have data as your number one or a very important asset to your organization, you should treat it as such, and you should do something like event sourcing. Okay, all right. I'm off my soapbox right there. Okay. So you might be wondering, okay, Eric, I'm new to CQRS. I'm new to this paradigm. You're talking about the read and write side. What are you talking about? I probably should get a glass of water here while I make sure my notes are up to date. I'm going to drink real quick. Cool. Well, here's a very simpler handler for a query. Again, some of you may know this already, some of you don't, but here is a handler get cart by ID class, and you can see there's an interface, and there's two arguments there. One is saying, hey, here's the query, and then here is the view model that's going to be returned. Let's add some notes here just to be descriptive. There we go. And yeah, we're going to leverage some database. Doesn't matter. Could be Oracle, MySQL, Maria, Postgres, Redis, Mongo. The list goes on and on. It doesn't matter. That's why I called it iReadDB. It doesn't matter, at least in this instance, right? But you can see it's being injected through DI. And then there's a handle method that really is 2 lines, arguably. It Could it be crammed into one? Sure. But legibility is important. And we're saying, okay, I'm going to receive this query, which again is already encapsulated, has all the rules, so to speak, which just needs to make sure the ID isn't null. So we don't have null checks in every handler. Oh, that is the worst. But we're saying, hey, let's go to this read database. Let's pretend it's Postgres because I'm a Postgres fan. Let's load it asynchronously. Here's the view that all the events are going to be folded upon or being projected, so to speak. And yeah, unless that's null because the aggregate wasn't found, like maybe we were given a bad ID. So it wasn't empty in the query, but it's just there was a typo, which that should have been caught earlier on. But yeah, so unless that stream isn't there, we will be providing the view model, which is shopping cart view class. Really simple, right? So again, a benefit of having these commands and queries separated, having dedicated handlers for them in an event source system specifically, makes your code very boring, which is awesome for testing. Like how is this test going to work out? Well, I don't have an example, but the idea is that, hey, as long as that injection's there and that object's there, it's going to be present or not. Super, super boring, which is great. That's what we want. Okay, so let's talk about all this at large, right? Because we're here to talk about strategies for event sourcing. In this graphic, even though I do like it, it can be a little overwhelming if you're new to this space. So let's simplify it a little bit. We're going to use a diagram that our friend Eve made, which I do like quite a bit. And again, I'll probably keep using it as time goes on. So we have our writes on the left side and our reads on the right side. A little confusing. So let's use some better names. These are names I really like and I've grown to use more and more as time goes on. That is having a source of truth, because we're writing events to an immutable append-only log. There's a source of truth, and then there's the reactive side. Because, and we're going to dig into this a little bit, and we'll dig into it further in further webinars, because when you have all that rich data and you see things that are happening like shopping cart fulfilled, order started, you have these descriptive events, order shipped, order delivered at customer's address, or whatever event, order fulfilled would be a better name. You can then have certain, oh, I didn't hit next. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, everyone. Probably wondering, yeah, I see a comment about what's happening. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about with source of truth. I was clicking the wrong slide. I'm sorry. But when you have this reactive side on the right-hand side, you can react to events that are well intended, that are well written, have good naming, and you can have different services or microservices, layers of your application, whatever terms you want to call it. You can have them react accordingly. You can have them write to different databases, like the example shows: document database, graph database, relational database. You can have them create new events to begin new processes. And we aren't going to get into it here, but this is how you effectively make good process managers. Some people call them sagas. There is a difference. Not going to get into that today, but you can have these reactive components listen and create new streams and check things, right? And it's incredibly powerful. So when people say, yeah, we have a system that's event driven, or yeah, we're using event sourcing, to me, and this is certainly not to gatekeep, but I would say the better examples, the better systems, the more thorough and robust systems I've heard and seen are things that leverage these capabilities that a true, good, well-purposed, well-intended event store can do, by being able to subscribe to events in real time, not rely on some batch job, not having to worry about retention of messages over a week period or whatever, but having stuff that is persisted as a source of truth, again, that are well modeled, as we talked about, and being able to react to those going through, because you have listeners that are subscribed. To me, that is what makes all this click, and we're gonna go into that a little bit further. So let's think larger. Let's expand our view. Let's think about integration. Integration's scary, right? Can be scary. Whew. blow your mind. Hopefully not. So one thing that I think a lot of us at Event Store and the community at large, really, when it comes to event sourcing, we have this burden. That sounds dramatic. That the word event is overloaded. It's used everywhere. And that's just kind of how it is. Just like the word write. Very confusing. Is there a W or not at the beginning? But what is an event? Are you talking about messages? Are you talking about a command or a query? These are tough things, absolutely. So let's think about this another way. This again is not like an implementation strategy. It's more like a thought pattern that can really be of assistance to you. If again you're new to this space, or maybe you've had some messaging or event-driven woes before. So there's this concept. Not exactly sure if someone specifically coined this, but it's the idea of having inside events and outside events. I really like this quite a bit. Some folks call it inside data and outside data. That's okay, sure. Same thing, right? Words do matter, but sometimes you don't need to cause a ruckus about it. So let's think about 4 different systems across an organization. They communicate internally. They have these commands and queries going on. System 1 has its own things going on. It's recording to its own ledger, its own source of truth, its own event store. Same with system 2. Maybe system 3 and 4 don't do event sourcing. There just isn't a great use case there. It's more very boring CRUD related tasks, which is fine. That's okay. Event sourcing generally it's not that strong there. But they have their own ecosystems, their own worlds, their own domains, if I dare say. Just to sprinkle in some DDD verbiage. They have their own bounded contexts, perhaps. But occasionally they may talk to each other. They may need to emit messages, and these messages may be commands, queries, or events, right? So that hopefully shouldn't be confusing, but when we talk about these products and implementation details, the words get a little messy, right? So when systems communicate with each other, and it may be applications, it depends on your use case, those are considered outside events or outside data, right? So they're going outside of their bounds to communicate with whatever they need. So there's data on the inside when you're talking about a specific context or system. Again, it depends. I'm not going to pick that apart in this conversation. But then there's data or messaging on the outside. So I think having that mental model is super powerful, especially if you're new to these paradigms and getting overwhelmed, or you might want to restructure how things are already being done. This is a very important tool to have in your tool set. So let's talk about some other points that people tend to ask about or are curious about, or maybe after they've been in production for a while, they're like, oh, I have 1 million events in my stream. Or I think the longest stream I've seen was like 32 million events. It's a very long stream, and it shouldn't have gone that long. But this is a concern that a lot of architects and lead developers have before they get started. Like, well, what happens? Well, I would say you should have modeled better. That's the short, snarky answer. But the internet, if you were to Google it, typically you will see almost immediately say, hey, use snapshots. Use snapshots. Now, snapshots they're a technical solution. I guess you could consider them a strategy of sorts, and they are useful. I know there's systems where I wish we had snapshots, but with proper good modeling and understanding things at large, which you may not get at your first go around with your first proof of concept, your prototype, your first one in production, maybe even after your second. Maybe you've been following this space for years and you're like, well, yeah, the stream goes on forever, doesn't it? I was that person at one point. Well, you can certainly do that. And there's a good article on Event Store. I think it's probably the top result in most search engines, to my knowledge. But we talk about how snapshotting it is a valid strategy and can be useful, especially if you want to put things in cold storage, so to speak. Now you may notice with these events here, there's a clear beginning and a clear end. uh, a start and an end of these events, this life cycle of events. And that's one thing I kind of want to pull out and talk about this strategy at large here. That's really important because that was, I would say, well designed. Hey, yeah, this thing begins and it has an endpoint. It doesn't live forever. I don't have a slide for this. I wish I did now that I think about it. But when I was in the e-commerce space, we had streams for each product. And do products come and go? Do they get deprecated or what have you, or updated with a new number or ID? Yeah. But some things, I mean, those SKUs, those stock keeping units, the seller keeping units, they may last forever, for decades. Those IDs don't change. And that can be a problem when you have your inventory and pricing and all your content related strategies on one stream, especially if that's a hot selling product during the pandemic. And there's hundreds and hundreds of events a day, or maybe thousands a day happening and being appended to that stream. Were there issues after a while? Yeah, it took a while, but that's where snapshots wouldn't have been a bad idea. But I would say, again, just to reiterate, that modeling helps even more, but you may not understand good modeling techniques initially. So snapshots, great use case if you're inheriting an older system or you can't deviate from the model because of what have you. Again, business constraints or bandwidth, just to use that term. But yeah, there's a couple articles. I think I said that incorrectly earlier. There's a couple articles about snapshotting with event sourcing in general, and then Event Store DB, how it can be done. So definitely, if you want further details about that, I would check those articles out. So what I was getting at is, well, you should model after the real world. You know, if you're a cashier and you're at your cash station, you have a beginning of a shift, and maybe you have a break point, break point conceptually. But you also have an end shift. So if you only work 4 hours, making money on the weekend, what have you, there's a beginning and end, and there's your stream. Boom, done. So by modeling after the real world, and I'm not talking about MTV Real World for those that were around in the 90s, but like you should model after real life, man. Think about how things are being done. Is there a beginning and end of this product life cycle? Well, let's do it explicitly. So I've heard the term be called closing the books, which really is more, I would say, accurate from the accounting world. I thought I was going to be accountant at one point in my life, so that kind of rings true for me. There's quite a few people here. So really that's like a more technical or historically accurate term, closing the books. So if you want to end the stream every month or quarter or year, that is certainly a good strategy. I would highly advise doing something like that when you're doing modeling techniques like event storming or event modeling or domain storytelling. I don't talk about those in this webinar, but you should certainly explore them if you haven't already. If you're not doing those types of methodologies and activities to determine how to best model them, or you don't have the support on your team to do so, then just do it the old-fashioned way, which is by time. At the end of this week, month, year, whatever works, right? But another Eve here at Event Store talks about breaking streams explicitly, which again, same idea. Now, when you're closing the books, there's all sorts of different modeling techniques, as I mentioned. Really what you're doing is modeling the temporal aspects of your domain, temporal modeling, not to be confused with bitemporal modeling, but really you're saying, okay, this makes sense. This is when we have like a milestone or an endpoint. If there's like a milestone in a process like underwriting, when it comes to underwriting insurance or mortgages or life insurance policy or what have you, if someone needs to sign off on something, that's a great time to just end the stream there. And then when you create a new stream for the next segment of that process, maybe another team handles it, maybe not. It depends. But excuse me. But it's the idea that, okay, well, let's link or let's reference the other one. Let's put in that stream ID into the next event or the new stream, and it can be referenced. That way, when you're doing commands or a query, they can be referenced. It's kind of like, in a way, a linked list. If you're familiar with that data structure, you're pointing towards the next area or the last one. Again, implementation details, but really powerful tools. And it's great to, and I guess the cost is that ideally you model and think about these things before you start writing code. And I know that is try to be mindful of time, but that's kind of the biggest, I think, thing or turnoff for folks when they come to this world from a very CRUD centric world where you can just kind of write whatever you need in a document store or just get a new table or column appended. Yeah, that works, but are there consequences to those actions? Sure. Are they simpler? I think for a lot of teams, the way they're structured and a lot of the way we do software engineering, it can seem simpler, but it has larger ramifications down the line, as opposed to well-intended modeling or not being afraid to create new versions of events, which is sadly something we're not going to talk about in this webinar. But evolving your event schema shouldn't be too, hopefully, not too consuming or frighten you. I think it's something that it's kind of like a boogeyman in our community, and we need to address that. But I digress. So modeling, very important. It can get you away from snapshotting if you need to do snapshotting because of technical constraints or needs. Understandable. So another question that's asked, and we're kind of slowly wrapping up here, but another thing to consider is, how do I ensure uniqueness? There's a few different ways to handle it. We're going to address one primarily here, but certainly would love to hear if you have any other strategies. Again, leave a comment, whether you're in the chat or on a YouTube video, or if you want to tweet out, that's great. We'd love to hear it. So one way, and I only learned this maybe a year and a half ago, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's say the problem itself is we need to ensure unique identifiers, and you're doing some sort of user management system, and your stream names of your events are modeled after the email address that users sign up with. Okay, that makes sense. There are certainly a lot of CRUD and relational examples of, if you think of your typical user table where the primary key, that first column, is an email. It ensures a unique constraint. It's at the technical implementation level, which is in the short term, that's great. Just is something in use there? No? Okay. But what happens when there needs to be an email change? Again, in that traditional data model world, relational model world, okay, that you might have to do some finagling, right? Maybe insert a new row, deprecate the prior one. Maybe there's like a soft delete column, things like that. Maybe there's some sort of referential or foreign key funniness you need to do. I mean, it's not impossible. A lot of us have solved these types of problems. But again, we're owning up to the fact we had a quick and easy solution initially because of how we're used to creating relational tables, and now we're kind of paying the cost for it. Now there needs to be stories added to Jira. Things need to get figured out, right? So what's interesting is that you could have a separate stream that is kind of similar to the all stream. For those that are familiar with Event Store DB, there is the all stream, which is all the events. Even if you're using a cluster of Event Store DBs that communicate and ensure everything's being written sequentially and it's idempotent. Did I say that right? I think so. But effectively, it's like a claim of sorts. So while you can have unique streams for each user, they probably shouldn't be just their email. You should probably have a good naming practice, but also you can have an all emails type, should be the next slide. There we go. Stream, and it has its own events, and it's more of a, not really like a technical implementation, right? But because it is important to the business that, hey, this email has been claimed. In a way, it's part of the business invariant, arguably, whether the domain experts agree or use that terminology or not. I mean, really, you're saying this user can only have one unique email. So it might not be written in some process and some documentation, but that is a implicit requirement of the business. So you can have events like email claimed or email unclaimed, right? So just have a single stream that you can aggregate and check on. Maybe you put it in memory, so it's very quick. If you're someone in the FANG world or what have you, saying, well, my stream, my database has 1 million users or hundreds of millions of users. First off, congratulations. I'm being facetious, I'm sorry. But two, I mean, 1 million events, especially if it's just like a single property or two, that is nothing. In a good purpose-driven event store like Event Store DB, or honestly any other good solutions, that is nothing. That is nothing at all. You should not be afraid of that. Not a big deal. So if you need to aggregate and it takes, I'm just making up numbers, I guess, at this point, but it's a quick check. Maybe you put it in memory just to ensure it's really performant. Maybe you don't. Then fine. You can ensure that there is uniqueness in your system for that domain slice. And really that can be applied to all sorts of things. Emails, I think, are probably the best, easiest to understand example. But depending on what you're doing, even if it's like on the AI or ML side where you're needing to ensure there are unique constraints or things for your data set, same concepts apply. I mean, we're talking about users and shopping carts and orders because they typically are easier to get a grasp of because a lot of us do those things or work with those things, right? But this certainly can be applied to even internal systems that are like the engine for driving. Again, thinking about the left and the right, your source of truth and your reactive side. You could have it be more technically inclined and have it effectively be the engine to fuel everything else. Something to think about. Let me check one thing real quick. Okay, yeah. So given the amount of time we're going to cut it off there. Here are some resources. A lot of it is from eventstore.com. There's some other blogs and articles and GitHub repos. I really recently publicized an e-commerce repo that I'm going to be working from a lot more. That some of the code you saw is deriving from. There's also the Event Sourcing Net Core, and then there's a talk from Eve about keeping it simple as well. So all sorts of resources. If you have any questions, now's a great time. Again, if you're watching this on demand at a later time, feel free to reach out. Discord is hopping. Again, there was some really good discussions just in the last few hours. And here are my contact information if you need to reach out. But I really appreciate everyone's attentiveness. Appreciate so many people came out.
Oh, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat now. If you have questions and you think of them later or whatever, as Eric said, please reach out to him on any of these channels that he's showcasing here. But if not, that was amazing, Eric. Thank you very much. And we look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar.
Me too. There's a lot of things I want to dive into.
Excellent. Thanks ever so much.
Bye, everyone.